Hello everyone, it is Press Any Button and we are not in Unity this time. In fact, we're in Microsoft Edge once again. And that is because we're going to be starting a new series. It's going to be a really short one and it's going to be in the lead up to Halloween. And the reason for doing so isn't because I'm a Halloween fanatic, because I'm not at all. But it's actually because this will help as a lead up to a project that I want to go into after we've finished this. And that's going to be working in 3D instead of 2D, because we've done the bullets tutorial. The invaders tutorial is pretty much done at this point, and we've only done sort of 2D mobile retro games, and that's a bit of a waste because Unity can provide a lot more because it is, you know, it's a full-fledged engine and we should be able to use it thus. So as you can see right now, I'm just looking at a bit of inspiration. I'm looking at these spooky forests and I'm looking at this spooky forest, and I'm just trying to get a feeling for what kind of environments invoke a spooky, a menacing tone, because that's what we're going to be working on today. We're actually going to be working on some terrain. So let's go over to Unity and see what we need for this new project. Now, when you're making your new project, you remember that you have the window when you open up Unity and it has your account name and everything like that. Make sure that your project is set to 2D. And I've already imported my assets from that screen, but we can do the same thing here. So let me show you some of the assets that we need to import. So I'm just going to go over to Assets, Import Package. And what we're going to need to import for this project is characters. So we're going to need that characters package, and we're going to need environment. Particle systems, all these other things, we don't really need them. But we might be messing around with some fog. I'm not sure. Might be getting a bit adventurous with that. Wouldn't hurt to sort of dabble in things like that. But continuing on, once you've imported all those packages, you should have a scene just like mine. And you should be able to look at your assets folder and see, oh, you've got your standard assets, you've got your characters folder, and you've got your environment folder. As you can see, I went a bit in with importing my packages because I didn't really know what I'd need for this project, but we only need characters and environment. So as I explained earlier, in this first part of this tutorial, we're going to be focusing on making some terrain. So to do that, let's go over to the hierarchy, right click, as always, and then we need to go over to 3D object and then terrain. And here we have it, our little terrain looking plane thing. Well, it doesn't look like terrain right now, it just looks like a basic plane. And I'll just let this load in real quick, make sure everything's as it needs to be. And it seems that our terrain is fully into this scene. So let's just take a look at our terrain. It's kind of big. It's hard to tell actually, but I would venture that it's kind of big. If we were to sort of walk around this terrain, I reckon it would be kind of big. And it's very flat. There's nothing happening on it, it's untextured, it is nothing. And at that point, we'd have to leave everything to sort of imagination. We'd have to go back to our horror journals and be like, ooh, maybe this could be on our terrain or this and that. But we don't open Unity, so we can just use our imagination. What we want to do is make this terrain spooky. So how are we going to do that? Well, first things first, let's make this terrain a bit more traversable. So let's make sure that it's not too big. Now with terrain, I'm pretty sure Unity works in units. So as you can see, I've just gone over to the inspector here, and then I've gone over to this settings cog right here. And I've scrolled down, and when we scroll down we find resolution options. Now in our resolution options, let's take a look at terrain width, length and height. So our terrain height, that's pretty good, 600 units above, because that means that we can add depth to this terrain, I believe. Now in terms of our width and length, those seem pretty good. Those are 500 meters in width and 500 meters in length. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about them using meters here. So I'll just go on to say units anyway. So we see that everything's pretty much as it needs to be. Now starting off with you people at home, it's probably going to be like something like 1,000 units, and you're going to be able to see that really easily just by them. Immense nature. Oh, add one more zero on that. just by the immense nature of this terrain. When you open it up, you'll be like, okay, this something's a bit wrong with this. This looks a bit too big. So we'll just go over to here. And just as we do with any other component in Unity, we just click in the boxes next to it and input our values. Okay, so we've looked at our terrain, we've looked at its size, and we've thought to ourselves, okay, what can we do to this terrain to make it a bit more spooky? And that brings us back to our Google searches. Now let's take a look at this terrain here. Alright, so on the bottom we've got some murky colors. Now if I were to describe the whole color palette of this thing, I would say very, very murky. I'm not an art major or anything, but I can say that these are some sort of cold, despondent colors, and that makes things really nice and eerie. This fog adds for low visibility, just as in this picture, so it's like, ooh, what could be hiding in that fog? What could I be hiding from through that fog? Is something looking for me. And we've got these trees that are pretty big, they're pretty dark, they're pretty bare, and that sort of sense of lifelessness, that's really nice. That's a really good tone setter. Nothing vibrant happening in this scene. Even the floor is all brown and, you know, mushy with autumn leaves and just moss and things like that. And in this picture we see that this very grey picture, actually, super grey picture, probably just the way it's shot and possibly edited. We can see that the ground is a bit bumpy here. We've got pathways cut out through, you know, trees overhanging, and we've got that fog again. We've got the presence of a lot of shadows, and in both of these pictures everything seems kind of dim. So that's what we're going to be aiming for. So let's think up a couple of bullet points or criteria points for our environment. Okay, so it needs to have trees. Let's just start off with that. It needs to have trees, because trees block visibility. Trees are a bit overbearing, and they're just a great horror device. Now our floor here, we need to have a dark floor. We can't have vibrant colors and be like, oh no, there's something chasing you, because that's not going to work. That's just going to be like any other game, and then the player's going to be like, where's my gun then? Because this isn't a horror game, obviously. Now the fog we might be able to add on later. I have not looked into how we can do that. We want dim lighting. That's definitely something that we want. And we want a bit of flatness, but we want a bit of curvature at the same time. So I'm thinking a couple of rolling hills, no mountains or anything, but just a couple of rolling hills, pathways that are surrounded by trees. Okay, so let's go back into Unity, because that's been a lot of talking, and let's see how we can actually make that a reality. So the first thing we want to do is carve out our terrain. And how are we going to do this? Well, on the inspector for our terrain, we can see that we have a different array of options here, and all of these options represent different brushes. So this is a raise/lower terrain brush. This is a paint height brush. This is a smooth height brush. This is a paint texture brush. This is a place trees brush. And this is a paint details brush. So let's start off with this raise and lower terrain brush. So the first thing we want is to establish a starting point for our player. So I'm thinking sort of like just here, really. We don't really need to stress over this too much, but here would be a nice place. And I was thinking that would be nice to have something happening in the middle. So like little linking pathways, but something happening in the middle. But I'll be working on that outside of the lesson. In this lesson, we're just going to focus on getting our bearings on these tools. So let's take a look at these different brushes. Now we can see that these different brushes allow us to have different sizes. This is a very thick brush. These are smaller brushes, smaller yet. But we can actually adjust the brush size to accommodate our needs. So this seems like a pretty good size for me. So let's take a look at what happens when I click here. Alright, so we have a hill coming up. It's doing its thing, and then when we leave it, it sort of looks like that. Now that's a bit steep for what I was wanting. Maybe, yeah, I think that's a bit steep for what I was aiming for actually. So how can we correct that? Well, first thing that we need to do is hit Control Z, and then let's look at the opacity for our brush. Okay, so the opacity here means how much of an effect do we want our brush to make on this terrain. So if I turn this opacity down to like 15 or 16 or something, then we see that the hills that we produce are actually quite shallow now. And I'm kind of liking this. I'm kind of liking that. So let's just work with those hills and just place them into that corner there. Alright, so now we've got some nice smooth rolling hills in this corner here. Maybe close up the entrance a little bit so the player won't want to walk back and fall off the edge. And then do the same on this side. Now let's turn down the opacity to about 10, see what happens there. And now we've got more shallow hills. And as you can see, the more I stay on a piece of land or terrain, the more it will be affected by the brush. So the longer I stay on a piece, the more it will bulge out relative to the size that we've set for the actual opacity. So that seems pretty good. That looks like we've got something, sort of a clearing happening here. And then if I change that opacity down to 5, we could just have something that makes the player want to follow this general route. Alright, so we've got nice bumpy uneven land right here. Now there's a bunch of brushes that we can mess around with. We can mess around with these brushes, and I could turn the opacity up to 9 here. I could just do that a bit. Just grain it up just a tiny bit. As you can see there, it looks nice and grainy. It's much easier to see when I'm still holding it down, but yeah, you can see that it looks nice and grainy. Now let's switch over to the next brush. Now what does the next brush do? So we've got this part of our terrain, which is some sort of nice gentle rolling hills which we can carve out to put some devices in there. So how are we going to vary out this terrain? Well, we have our paint height tool. Now what our paint height tool does is it allows us to make a flat piece of land according to where we want our height to be. So I'm just going to turn this opacity up to 50 again, and I'm just going to demonstrate what that actually looks like when we use this tool. So you see here we've got a very flat protrusion in the terrain. Now that looks really unnatural. That looks like some kind of pillar, you know, one of those desert pillars out of Dragon Ball Z or something. So let's hit Control Z and adjust that height a little bit. So let's tone down that height, 25 maybe, and let's put these sort of plateaus in this corner here. There we go, and just have them meet up with the start of our terrain. And then if we want, we can go back here, and then we could be like, let's dot these up a little bit. So just dot up our terrain. So we've got flat plateaus, but they're still bumpy, they're still a bit uneven. Now let's go over to our smooth height tool. Now this tool is going to be a lifesaver if you're looking to make your terrain not super jagged and a bit more natural. So let's use this as an example. We've got terrain that is super bumpy right here, but we probably don't necessarily want that because that doesn't look too natural. That looks a bit dodgy. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we're going to select a brush while we're here with the smooth height tool, and then let's take a look at what this tool actually does. And as you can see, I can go over this really quick and my terrain becomes nice and smooth. And that really helps out if there are some issues with just how bumpy our terrain is being. We can just quickly go over that, make these hills really roll nice and naturally, as I keep saying. and just make everything look a little bit more natural. Okay, so that is it for the terrain brushes. The next set of brushes are going to be for texturing and adding in trees and foliage. So I'm just going to come back in a second after I've done a couple of things with this terrain and molded it in a couple of ways, just so we have something a little bit more finished to work off of when I come back. Hello everyone, I did say that I'd come back with a finished product, but I'm not quite finished. I just remembered something, and that is our ability to actually lower our terrain, because this says raise and lower. So if we hold shift, as it says here, we can actually lower our terrain. So if I hold shift there, I can lower this terrain to make it flat again. And that helps if we want to just lower our terrain for whatever reason we want to do that. So that's just a bit of a helpful tip if you're modeling your terrain, because you can just lower it and then start again pretty much without having to go through the whole Control Z process. But anyway, I'll be back in a second. Okay. Alright, so I've come back with a bit more of a completed product, and let's take a look at it. Now, it's kind of useless for us to be taking a look at it through the view of our, I don't know, like omnipotent camera. So let's take a look at it from the perspective of our player. So if we go down to characters here, and this is why we imported the package, go down to first person controller, and then click that prefabs folder, we see this thing called FPS controller. Now if we drag that into the hierarchy here, it's been added to our game. Now let's move it around to where we want the starting point of our game to be. So I'm just going to click on this icon here to activate these gizmos. Then I'm going to drag it over to here. Make sure it's not clipping into the terrain, otherwise it'll just fall through on play. Just bring that up a little bit. And here we have our first person controller, and they are a really good way of seeing how our terrain is actually coming together in terms of how our player is going to be able to interact with our terrain. So I'm looking at my terrain right now and I'm like, okay, we don't have much clear pathing. We've got sort of some clear pathing here, but it's not as narrow as it could have been. And I really want my player to know that they need to go up this hill to get a certain item, and that they can go through here and they can go through here. So that's going to be something that we can fix with a bit of texturing and a bit of messing around with those terrain brushes some more. But I'll do that after we finish the lesson. First, let's hit this play button and see what this actually fully looks like from the perspective of our first person controller. Okay, so here we have our first person controller. You'll have to forgive my PC, guys. It is dying at this time. It's not a very good one. But let's just walk through and see what's happening here. Okay, so everything's super white. It's like we're in heaven, or like we're in some kind of ice survival level or something. So we're going to have to fix that with a bit of texturing and a bit of changing that skybox, of course. But if we look up, we see that we've actually got a skybox, and Unity just starts us off with that to begin with. Now, from the view of our first person camera, and if you're having some issues controlling this first person controller, it's just, you know, WASD controls, just moving around with the mouse, and everything should be pretty similar to other games that you've played if you play on PC. So let's take this pathway here, and we can see that it's sort of established. So we've got our mountains coming through here. They're a bit soft, they're a bit smooth, but that's okay. We've definitely directed our player through this sort of trench here, and maybe they could, you know, come to discover something over here, and maybe it would be really cool, interesting, or scary event that we could allow to happen. But now that we've finished looking through the perspective of our first person controller, if we hit escape, we're given our mouse again, and then we just have to hit that play button again to exit play. So let's think about some things that we could do to improve our terrain at this point. I wonder what we could actually do to improve this terrain. Well, the answer is really simple. Actually, I'm not going to tease it along because this video is getting pretty long. I'm going to go over to the terrain game object here, and then I'm going to go to this paint texture brush, and I'm going to select a texture. So let's go to edit textures down here and click on add texture. Now we're going to need to select a texture. So what I did there is I clicked on that box saying select, and let's go through all of our textures. So right here we've got our mud rocky albedo texture, and that should be in the texture package that you selected. So if we double click on that, we've selected that texture. And then let's set these values a little bit higher, so I'm going to put them up to 30, because otherwise we'll be able to see the tiling of the texture, which is something that I didn't realize a lot of games actually had if you properly look at them. So if you see that your textures are repeating and it's kind of obvious, you just want to up the size of the texture. And for me, I just did that by doubling the size of the texture. Now, you might not be able to ever fully avoid that. There might be some patches where you're like, okay, if you stand at like 1,000 units away, you'll see that that texture is repeating a bit. But that's okay, that's fine. We'll think of some fixes for that down the line. Okay, so let's hit add. And this becomes our base texture. Now look at that. Doesn't that look a little bit groggier? And I like this texture because I think it's got a little bit of bitmapping happening. I'm not sure. I haven't trained my eyes for these things, but I do remember that that's quite important in adding depth to our textures. So what's the next thing that we could do? What's the next thing that we could add to make this terrain a little bit more terrain-like? Okay, so we've got a bunch of mud everywhere. What goes on mud sometimes? We get a bit of grass, you know, mud, grass, dirt, those sort of things. They all mix together. So let's go to edit textures, add texture, and then here we're going to select another texture, and let's find some grass. Let's find some green stuff. So we could go for that cliff albedo, but we're not really looking at changing our cliffs right now. Here we go, we have grass hill. If we double click on that and then hit add, we can see that we've been given the option to paint in our grass. Now the brushes work the same, and the brushes work the same as every other brush that you've used in primary or elementary school if you're watching this from somewhere that is in the UK. And that is, we just paint stuff. So let's pick a real fun brush for our grass texture and paint that in. So let's just select this. Well, let's select the right texture first. With our texture selected and with the opacity sort of where we want it, let me bump that up to about 35. Let's just add in our grass texture, and look at that. Does that not look a lot nicer? And that's not what we want, because this needs to be horror. So let's make this nice and patchy. Let's make this perturbing to whoever plays this game, because they're going to want more grass. But we're not going to provide that, because we're here to scare them. We're here to scare them because we are interesting people making a horror game. So I'll paint that fully in a second, but as you can see, we can mess around with our brush size, our opacity, our target strength, and all these things, and we can make sure that our terrain is looking like a real terrain if we really put in the time and the work. We can mess around with the brushes, make sure that things aren't repeated over too much, and then if we walk around with our first person controller, we can take a look at how that looks. Alright, so I'm in my first person controller and this looks pretty good. It kind of looks like the Windows XP thing, sort of, if you blur your eyes and pretend that it actually looks like this. And we can see that our terrain's actually looking a lot nicer. It's looking a lot more like, you know, an actual piece of terrain. It's not looking like we've just slapped a white blanket over some kid's Play-Doh set. It's actually looking like a real piece of nice terrain, and we can see the hills over there, we can see all these things, and you know, this is a really nice plane that we have to establish some kind of spooky base camp or something. We've got some nice paths down here. We've got this brown texture coming through every now and then, so our grass isn't as, you know, established as we might want, because we want to make this sort of an uncomfortable experience, a horrifying experience. And then down here it looks kind of like a junkyard, but we'll fix that in due time. But looking at our terrain, looking at our texturing, that's pretty good for what we've started off with. So what's the next thing that we want to do? Well, we could add some more textures by just hitting edit texture, add texture, and then going through a bunch of things. But let's go on to the next part, which is adding our trees. Now, our trees are going to be, well, let's take a look at this. They are going to be very important to us in establishing a very spooky mood. They're going to allow us to block the player's perspective of the world. As you saw there, it was kind of easy for me to navigate. What we want to achieve is we want to have paths where our players like, okay, this is where I walk, but we don't want them to be like, oh, there's another path that I'll just, you know, walk later. We want them to get a bit lost. We want them to feel a bit claustrophobic. And that's what we're going to be able to achieve through some nice use of some trees. So how do we add our trees to our game? Well, that's simple enough. Let's go to edit trees, add tree. And then let's hit this little bullseye kind of looking thing and find a tree that we want to add. So here we've got a conifer. Might as well add that. That's pretty dark, that's pretty dim, it's pretty grim. So let's double click on that and then hit add, and now we've got a conifer tree here. We've also got a brush for where we want our trees to be placed, and we've got tree density. That is another option which I'm gonna go over in a second. But if we take a look at this, if we click here, so we've added in our trees, and I had a bit of a scare there where I was like, okay, has my computer just crashed? But that's okay. I'll just explain what this tree brush does instead of actually adding in all of our trees. Well, it's pretty self-explanatory actually. So we've got all these trees here, and they look really good actually. They look a bit better than I thought they would. And they're very tall, they're very sort of invasive, and they're very nice as a way to block our players' field of vision. And as you can see there, I've just clicked and added a couple more trees. We can also tone down the density of the trees that we add. As you saw me do, I manipulated the tree density right here. And what that does is it allows us to tone down the amount of trees that appear every time we sort of paint them in. So if I add a tree here, we've only got one tree because our tree density is about down to 20. If I add a tree here, add a couple more, then we start painting in a lot of trees. I think I'm going to hit Control Z because that was kind of ugly. But if we up our tree density, up our brush size, we will get more trees per click. But this seems like a pretty good tree density to brush size because we only get a couple of trees, and we sort of have a little bit of control over that. There are other trees that we can add, so we can sort of try to find those, hit that bullseye right there, and then find other things like broadleaf. I saw you, I did. Okay, broadleaf right here, and then double click, add, and we've got broadleaf trees that we can add in. So if I click there you go. It's a bit more vibrant, but that doesn't really matter. And then let's go over to our bushes. By the way guys, I'm going to clean this all up before the next lesson. I'm going to really try to establish something kind of nicer than this. But let's go over to here and take a look at our, I'm just going to call this the foliage brush, but it's called paint details. Now here we're able to add in things like just small plants, bushes, and grass. So I can find a grass texture by going to edit details, add grass texture. And then we go over to this little bullseye here and look for our grass. Now our grass textures, there we go. They're going to be looking a bit like that. And we're not looking for things like this, we're looking for things like that. So let's take a look. Is there anything a bit spookier than that? Oh, we'll just use this grass. So we've got this grass, we just double click and then we can hit add. Dry color, healthy color. Let's tone down that healthy color. I'm not sure if this will actually make a difference, to be honest. I haven't really messed around with this too much, but let's dim that healthy color. Alright, now we've got our grass and we can paint it in. So if I go down to here, get you to look at the start of the game and just paint in my grass. That's going to be a problem in a second. You can see that we've got a lot of grass, and you can see that our grass is coming in sort of a high density, and that's going to be a problem for my PC. So I'm going to hit Control Z for a second and hit it again to get rid of that grass, and let's take a look at how we can sort of tone down the amount of grass that pops up as we click. So I've just messed around with the opacity, and there we have, you know, slightly less full patches of grass. I would like a little bit less. This is sort of a murky, muddy terrain, so we don't want too much grass popping up. We don't want too much life in the scene, as I said before. So we've got all that grass set up and we've got our trees set up, and at this point we could just probably go to our first person controller and look at how things are. But let's change one little detail that's going to actually affect a lot of what's happening with our player's perspective in the game, which is to change the skybox. If we go over to our first person controller, we see that we have options for our skybox. But at this point we don't really have any control over our skybox. So let's go over to component, rendering, and then go to skybox, and we can see that options for our skybox are placed into the inspector for our first person character. So we're going to go over to this little bullseye here, and we're going to find a skybox that we want to use. So let's see, what's a nice dark skybox. And even though this isn't really a skybox, I think I'll just use it for the time being, because I didn't realize that we hadn't imported a skybox. But now that we changed our sky to navy blue, we can get a good feeling of what this place would be like in the dark. Now, just to close that up, let's go over to our directional light and tone down the intensity of our directional light to about 0.5, and that is nice and dim. I like that. And hit play and see what's going on. Alright, before my PC bursts into flames, let's just take a look around our scene, and this looks pretty good. We've got grass moving around, and it's moving around pretty nicely. We've got a bunch of trees. We've got decent textures working on the floor of our scene. We can hear our footsteps as we walk around, which this first person controller asset has kindly provided. And we can see my computer lagging out as it struggles to breathe. But anyway, that has been another press any button tutorial. In this part we were able to make some spooky-ish terrain. We were able to look at the basics of making our terrain, and I will come back definitely with a piece of terrain that's a lot more spooky and a lot more finalized than this. And I invite you guys to do the same by using the skills that we've explored in this session. But as always, that has been me, Press Any Button. Thanks for supporting the channel, thanks for being around. If you liked the video, you can leave a like. If you want to comment, you can leave a comment. If you want to subscribe, then you can subscribe, because I can assure that I will be back for another tutorial very shortly.